Welcome to the Level 2 training module for TOR Requirement 4, Legal and Other Requirements, which explains the fundamentals of this section in greater detail. While the intention of this training module is to increase understanding of R2 requirements, it is not intended to be used as a standalone guide. For the official text of all R2 requirements, download the R2 v3 standard from the CERI website. Core Requirement 4 addresses the need for an R2 facility to be in compliance with legal requirements that apply to their operations. The general principle for this core requirement is to comply with all applicable environmental, health, safety, and data security legal requirements, and only import and export electronic equipment, components, and materials in full compliance with all applicable importing, transit, and exporting countries' laws. The first requirement in Core 4 is to develop a legal compliance plan. This plan is intended to identify and define the environmental, health, safety, and data security requirements applicable to the R2 facility's operations, including any import-export laws that apply to the facility's shipments of electronic equipment, components, and materials. This plan should also include any customer or other requirements that the facility must meet. In addition to identifying requirements, the legal compliance plan must describe how the facility will maintain compliance. It should outline the controls and procedures implemented by the facility to comply with the identified requirements. It should also define the competence that is required by individuals responsible for key operations having to do with compliance. For example, an employee responsible for regulated or hazardous shipments should be knowledgeable of the hazards and regulations related to shipping such items. The facility must also document the monitoring that is required for the facility to maintain full compliance to all the legal and other requirements identified in the plan. Examples of monitoring may include supervisory oversight of regulated processes, safety walkthroughs and inspections, and regular reviews of compliance reports and shipping records. This legal compliance plan must be included as a part of the facility's environmental health and safety management system. When identifying the applicable environmental, health, safety, and data security legal requirements, the facility must consider its entire scope of operations, including all operations at the facility, as well as any off-site locations where R2 activities take place, such as an extra warehouse or collection center, or off-site locations under the control of the R2 facility, such as brokering or contractually managing items that do not pass through the R2 facility. The compliance plan should clearly identify where and how the requirements apply to each facility or operation. Some electronic equipment and materials have very specific requirements when shipping the items internationally, and some can even be prohibited from shipment altogether. As a result, an important aspect of the legal compliance plan is to identify and document the legal requirements for all countries involved in international shipments of electronic equipment, components, and materials. This can include the country of export, import, and even countries that the equipment or materials pass through while in transit. Proof of legality is required for all transboundary shipments, made directly by an R2 facility, as well as by any downstream vendors who export the R2-controlled streams. Demonstrating the legality of transboundary shipments can stop at the first R2 facility, since that facility has already demonstrated legality to an R2 auditor during their certification process. A common mistake is not demonstrating legality throughout the entire journey of the shipment. For example, a shipment of batteries originating in the United States may have one or more stops before reaching its final destination of Japan. In this example, the batteries are first shipped from the United States to Canada, which would involve the export requirements from the U.S. and the import requirements of Canada. From Canada, the batteries are shipped to Japan for final disposition, which would involve the export requirements from Canada and the import requirements for Japan. Facilities must demonstrate the legality of each leg of the journey, including countries where shipments may only pass through en route to final disposition. Examples of proof of legality for transboundary shipments could include a permit that expressly states the receiver is permitted to accept the specific material being sent to them for processing, or a letter from the country's competent authority granting permission for the import. Or it could be a link to an official government or similar website that clearly identifies the legality of the transfer of the material being shipped. An R2 facility must have processes in place to monitor its compliance, and ensure that all the requirements identified in its compliance plan are being met. To do this effectively requires a multi-step process. First, the facility must clearly identify the necessary actions and controls that are needed to comply with each of the identified requirements. Then, these compliance actions and control measures must be effectively implemented across all affected areas of the facility's operations. And the legal compliance plan must also be maintained current to address any new or revised requirements. This can include any changes to the requirements themselves or updates that are required as a result of changes in the facility or operations. For instance, when a facility implements new processes or accepts new types of electronic equipment or materials to manage. These updates must be reflected in the legal compliance plan. The next step in monitoring compliance is for the facility to conduct periodic audits to assess its compliance with legal requirements. The audits should be used to confirm that the applicable requirements have been identified and that appropriate compliance actions have been implemented and are effective. It's important that the audit is conducted by a competent auditor with knowledge of the legal requirements and the facility's operations. If a compliance audit results in any issues of noncompliance, the R2 facility must take corrective action to promptly stop and resolve those issues. One other important thing to note in the monitoring section. If an R2 facility receives any regulatory order or notice of violation that requires any action to address the issue as well as follow up with the issuing agency, the facility must notify their certification body within 30 days. Core Requirement 4 also includes several social responsibility requirements. Child labor, which is generally defined as dangerous and harmful work that interferes with schooling, is prohibited under R2, as is forced labor, where a worker cannot leave or terminate employment freely. Prison labor may only be used if it is voluntary and compensated beyond room and board, and skills are taught for gainful employment upon release. Core 4 also requires that the R2 facility document a non-discrimination policy calling for the fair and equal treatment of all workers. This policy must define the process to report, investigate, and respond to any discrimination complaints. The policy must be periodically communicated to all staff. To summarize, Core 4 requires developing a legal compliance plan that identifies all environmental, health and safety, data, and import-export legal requirements that apply to the facility's scope of operations, as well as any customer or other requirements. The legal compliance plan should also define the actions and controls needed to ensure compliance with all identified requirements, and must be regularly monitored and audited to ensure compliance. And lastly, R2 facilities must also comply with the social responsibility requirements in Core 4, Sections E, F, and G. For more information about the R2 v3 standard, visit the R2 Knowledge Base on the SERI website.